Recording live from the Hoban Law Group here in Denver, Colorado, I'm your host, Eric Singular. We're sitting alongside President and founder of the Hoban Law Group, Bob Hoban. Today we're talking about how the European cannabis market differs from North America and why it matters. We are joined by founder and CEO of FoliuMed Holdings, Oliver Zugel. Oliver, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. A very good day to you.
Oliver, whereabouts are you in the world?
Well, right now I'm in Madrid, about 20 kilometers outside, and enjoying the 40 degrees Celsius heat wave we have over here. So that's where I am right now.
Well, that's 40 degrees Celsius is up there. I hope you're doing your best to stay cool. You know, the thing I'd like to sort of lead off with, if you will, is this concept of the European Union and their discussion about CBD or other non-psychoactive cannabinoids as a quote-unquote novel food. And we've seen some vacillation on that particular issue. We've seen them in the last couple of days pause a little bit on that particular topic, them being the agency at the European Union, to say this, we might need to look closer to see whether CBD should be categorized or classified as a quote-unquote narcotic versus the novel food scenario. What do you know about that, and what do you think about that? Because we've talked a lot about the novel foods designation and the regulations and requirements that back that up. But tell me a little bit about your perception of that issue, because FoliuMed is capable of producing material that's API grade, in other words, pharmaceutical grade or perhaps narcotic grade, if you will, using that terminology, in addition to food or supplement grade. How impactful is this?
So, first of all, the situation and how CBD is regulated differs, country by country. So, there is really, and sometimes hard to understand for you in the US, there is no really harmonious scheme across the European Union of how the topic is treated. Let me start probably with the two markets which are most pronounced here, which is on the one hand Germany. In Germany, the situation is, I think, pretty clear in terms of that the narcotic office has ruled that anything except CBD isolate produced to a certain medical monograph and only for medical use is a narcotic. And that policy has been in place for quite a while, and therefore introduces a really interesting conundrum, which is if you're trying to bring in product, for example, broad spectrum extract with no THC, technically that also is a narcotic. So the Germans have taken on this a pretty black and white position. In as far as novel food is concerned, the large retailers in the country historically have been very cautious. They have tried to have CBD products at some point in time on the shelf, have taken them off again. But largely speaking, you don't really see the large retailers carrying it. So today the CBD market in Germany, therefore, is quite small. It's certainly very small compared to the population we have there. And most of it is being distributed online. So the Germans, I think, on this topic, again, are having quite black and white. They said CBD, unless it is an isolate, is a narcotic. That's the position of the narcotics office themselves. And the retailers have stayed clear because for them, the potential threat of a product being removed from the shelf after having spent the marketing has been, I think, quite material. So you have a bit of a black and white situation, and the tide has turned against CBD, is my notion. You're starting to see municipalities and some of the states actually enforcing this particular piece of regulation where they're saying CBD, if it is not an isolate, it cannot be on a shelf in any of our retail outlets. So there is, in my notion, a trend towards enforcing, I think, what has been the ruling in the country for a long period of time. Now, compare that to the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom has had, I think, continues to have the largest health and wellness market, relatively unregulated. And what happened there is that at some point in time, the Food and Safety Authority said, well, as of March next year, you cannot commercialize and sell a CBD product unless you have applied for novel food. So what happened next? Obviously, the novel food application process was quite complicated and is very complicated. Data requirements are high. So for the small brands, that's actually not viable. And so you started to have group applications coming in from some of the industry associations, which make it cheap for individual brands to get novel food authorization. And then what happened is that the authorities in Europe who are handling the novel food regulations started to receive a flood of applications. And applications really with minimal data support. And I think the bureaucrats at that point in time just said, I mean, we actually cannot handle this. And we don't have scientific evidence to make a call on it. And so therefore, the European Food and Safety Authority stopped to accept applications. And that, I think, has probably caused the wave you picked up in North America, where you're at the least the novel food route, which I think many of us had hoped would be coming through, I think it's becoming pretty uncertain at this point.
Well, that's certainly something that we're following closely. Do you believe that CBD products, for example, should be classified as a narcotic rather than a food ingredient? Or do you believe that there should be pathways to allow for both types of usage from a regulatory perspective, given your scientific background?
First of all, I don't think that if you have a CBD product which has zero THC in it, that it should be considered a narcotic. Having said that, I think given that the patients and consumers are using it for medical purposes, independently of what the label says and whether it's being marketed, I think it would benefit for these products to be regulated in the same way as any other plant-based medicines are being handled. But it's a pretty high standard. So you have a manufacturing standard behind it, you have a labeling standard, you have a standard with regards to contaminants. And lots of the vast majority of the health and wellness products in the UK, for example, where they're sold on a lightly regulated basis, they don't comply with this. So my personal view on it is if the THC component is in the levels that we're talking about, below 1%, that's what, for example, we have in Colombia, we have in Switzerland. I think, from my perspective, doesn't justify them being narcotics. However, I think they at the least need to meet, in my mind, a food supplement manufacturing standards and health and safety standards at a minimum. And I think those which are in higher doses, let's call it 70 milligrams plus, I think if you have formulations like this, I think they should be treated like plant-based medicines and follow the standards for that. Again, that doesn't mean, of course, no clinical trials, but yes, stability testing. And, the standard thing you would expect from any medication, whether it's OTC or prescription-based, I think for the higher dosages, that should be done in a way.
No, that's very well said.
I want to ask you a quick question, Oliver, about smokable hemp flower, smokable CBD flower, because we've talked to a number of folks in Europe, but I don't think we've really ever touched specifically on this. And I bring it up because here in the United States, we have seen a bit of an increased demand in some states for smokable hemp flower, and we've also seen it be a very controversial topic because law enforcement agencies really have minimal ability to discern between smokable hemp and marijuana, smokable marijuana flower. So I'm just interested, is there a market in your mind in Europe or Germany, the United Kingdom specifically, for a smokable CBD product, or not really?
So again, let me speak from a consumer demand perspective. I think there is consumer demand probably in all of these markets for it, but from a regulatory perspective, which I think is really what matters here, there are really only two meaningful places I know of, sizable places where smoking hemp flower is permitted. The most notable one is Switzerland, which always had relatively liberal treatment of cannabis and your and substances out of that category, and Italy on the other hand. And in Italy, it became a big fad about a year and a half ago. I think the police, for the same reason as in the US, they started clamping down on it. But enforcement in Italy, let's say compared to Germany, and leaving my own nationality here aside, I mean the enforcement is difficult in Italy. So you had smoke actually very meaningful business for smokable hemp flower there. I think in part because it precisely was used by some of the retailers to fundamentally then sell on THC containing varieties and say it's hemp. And I think the police obviously got the wind of it and they don't like it. In Germany, this has never happened because, again, it's black and white. I mean, you find a piece of cannabis flower in a shop, a big problem. UK, I believe, also has been very clear and clean on it. I think by the time, as you probably must have seen, by the time you open the ability for smokable hemp flower, I think it's a floodgate, and from an enforcement perspective, and therefore quite complicated now to control. So I don't see at all. So to come back to your question, I don't think this is going to be a big market over here. I can't see it. I think law enforcement is too deeply, rooted here against cannabis. Still, I think we're still a long way away from it. Now, if you go to some of the less regulated places like Italy, you can make a business, but it's going to be a small business and not an institutional business. I think that's how it is.
Well, as I think about the hemp flower market and I look at what the product lines look like, when you talk about those markets, is there a distinction between how the retail products are sold? Is it a flower that's sold? Is it a pre-rolled cigarette, a package of something that looks and feels like a tobacco cigarette? Or have those markets kind of just put it out there to see what the consumers will buy? Because as you said, it's become a fad, but there's not particularly a regulated process that allows for it when you think about the Italian distribution network. But I would presume that what's happening in Switzerland is a little bit more formalized. To your point, what do the retail products look like around smokable hemp flower in those locations?
In Switzerland, you would get it in a fully finished form as a pre-roll, even as a cigarette, so in a cigarette form, and in form of flower. In Italy, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that mostly it was flower, again for the reason which I mentioned before, which allows some of the retailers to move your THC-containing products and substitute one flower for the other. So there was a little bit more leeway over there to do it this way. I'm not sure whether Italy also does have fully finished, so they like pre-rolls and cigarettes. I just am not aware of it.
Oliver, let's jump over to this question really quickly. Let's talk about the global demand for THC flower. Can you speculate for us what you think that that number may be? And then as you look at more and more of these countries that are legalizing, or you look at where the opportunities are around the world, how much production, how much acreage do you really think is necessary to set aside to meet the demand for, I guess, THC flower or THC flower for extraction purposes to be made into a myriad of THC containing products? I'm just interested in your thoughts on this.
I always tell people an analogy, which I think relates to the German market, which is the largest medical market here in Europe, where last year there was a consumption of about 7 tons. For us, in our Colombian operations, to produce 7 tons requires just 1 hectare, so 10,000 square meters. It's fundamentally 3 tiny little greenhouses yeah, which you have because we run 4 harvests per year, and therefore it's not even 5% of our cultivation area. So imagine, I don't know the conversion to acres. You may, but from a hectare base, it's 10,000 square meters. You can produce the entire demand of 1 year of Germany from 1 hectare. I believe right now in Colombia only you must have, not for THC flower, okay, but I think with 200 license holders, you probably must have 500 to 700 hectares on the cultivation. Mostly CBD still, but you add to that the Canadian capacity, etc. I mean, it is really easy to see that there is a massive oversupply of flower for the market coming up, with the one limitation and difference, which is, as you know, for the flower to go into Europe, it needs to be EU GMP. And EU GMP by now, I think it's about a dozen of people who have the certification. So that's the only reason why, in my mind, the flower prices in Germany, you haven't crashed. It retails, a gram of flour in the pharmacy retails about 24 euros. I call that $27. And for us to produce 1 gram of that flour in Colombia costs us probably 10 cents, perhaps a little more for THC, but around that area. So you just see kind of, I mean, at some point in time, when I think more people will get to EU GMP on the one hand, and if more extracts are being used, which is, I think, completely inevitable in all of the European markets, I think the overhang of flour will be massive. I mean, we have cultivations now in Israel, of course, in Portugal, in Macedonia, Lebanon. I think is starting a program. All of South America, Africa, etc. So not hard to see that. I think in my mind the medical demand is small and will be growing relatively slowly. So yeah, no, I mean I really wouldn't want to be a massive, large-scale cultivator of THC in any of these locations. Will be very hard to place it.
So, I mean, when you look at that, when you look at those numbers, and I've read similar statistics, is the notion that all of these countries, and you mentioned a bunch of them that are creating laws and regulations and thinking that they're going to get into this global supply chain for THC. The question I always ask folks, particularly in Colombia over the past several years, when folks were very excited to say that they were either they just got their license or they were preparing to get their license and they were a couple of steps away. And I would ask them, what are you going to grow? And it was always a high THC, psychoactive or marijuana variety. And I'd say, who's your buyer? Who's your buyer? How could you have made that decision to pursue that licensure and the investment that goes along with it if you don't know who your buyer is? Because I will tell you, without looking at data, that the demand for international high THC products is very, very narrow. And to your point, while there might be a forthcoming demand at higher levels as pharmaceutical companies begin to develop drugs, you and I both know that takes a very long time for the numbers and the requirements of high production levels to come up, or countries are going to have to start enacting adult use like laws or make it more liberally available. And the German model is actually a very good medicinal model for that purpose. But at the end of the day, that requires substantial change to what the market is now. So, Oliver, what drives it? What drives these folks into making these decisions and to forecasting that the THC market on a global scale is going to be so large that country after country go after it, when I've always suggested that looking at a hemp plant that can have multiple uses, produce cannabinoids, grain, fiber, so forth and so on, is a more diversified program if you're going to go down the road of legalizing a form of cannabis. And it does other things. And the demand for, in the aggregate, all of those products is great on a worldwide scale. What is driving this madness, this fervor around legalizing marijuana for production and export?
I think so. As you said, you're fundamentally looking at two in my mind, well, probably three different businesses here when you look at the cannabis plant. On the one hand, when you're operating in the THC field, you're looking at a highly regulated business, which at least in Europe has significant barriers to entry in terms of you're producing locally, whether it's an extract or flower, very limited. And therefore, I think that's a business which just has the characteristics of a highly regulated, high barriers to entry market. And I think for some people that's attractive, and we feel that's a very attractive place to be. But you need actually to be small enough to see the light of day. I mean, and the capital markets, I think, who have provided the capital very cheaply when the Canadian markets were booming. I think fundamentally for the management team to justify what they were doing with the money, they needed to do bigger facilities. And investors were happy to do that. So they want to see proof of the pudding. And only proof of the pudding you could do when you were being handed over $100 million to CapEx is build a larger greenhouse. I think a bit like in the old internet days, I think the investor community is waking up to this. They're starting to have, fortunately by now, I think more realistic expectations. They have understood that cannabis in whatever shape or form doesn't lend itself particularly well to near-term cash flows, a long-term gain, I think, in some form. And with regards to what you said on hemp, and hemp-derived products, you're absolutely right. I think the massive demand will come from there, one would think. And in particular, I think, as you always have said, when you're looking at textile and other applications, I think, and in Colombia, I think they're starting to think about regulating this. Now, one interesting tidbit, which is very often overlooked also, I think right now the prices I am seeing in the US for hemp products and hemp-derived products, they're actually below probably what our current production costs would be even in Colombia for the time being. I was surprised myself to see that dynamic kind of coming over. So even the CBD side of things, I don't think it doesn't lend itself to quick money making. I think you need to pick your spot there reasonably well. So coming back to your question, why do people do this? I think often at the beginning, probably some form of misunderstanding of what the potential looks like and how easy it is to ship narcotics from one border to the other. People come from pharma, like our German partners, where we have a EU GMP facility. They understand this completely. I mean, they've been dealing in narcotics and opioids for a long time, and they know that every single request you put up to the regulator, just on its own, will take 3 months to get a response to. So it's just very slow moving. It is, and I think given that most of the guys in the industry didn't really come from pharma, but they came from either agricultural things or they're bankers or marketeers or consumer goods people. Understanding that finesse and the challenge of getting a narcotic internationally shipped and what it requires, I think it's hard to see. And I really only was lucky enough to work with our pharma partners for long enough have me being able to see it. And I think it's a difficult challenge and it takes a long time.
Oh. Very well said, Oliver. And you said at the very beginning, even in Europe, it is not extremely harmonious. And it's very interesting to get this information from you and hear you talk about the different markets in Europe, the different markets around the world, to ultimately move towards a more harmonious global market for these products. But it definitely feels like we have a long way to go. But we thank you so much for coming on the Hoban Minute and sharing your perspective with us. And we can't wait to have you on again, Oliver.
Well, it was very kind, and I wish you guys a very good day. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hoban Minute. Do you have any ideas for episode topics or guests? We would like to hear from you. Reach out to us at media@hoban.law and stay tuned for more on the Hoban Minute.